So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Gore, and I'm the head of customer success here at Cobweb. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, which is entitled Ransomware, the Growing Threat to SMBs. Thanks for all of you who are joining us today, and there are more as we speak arriving. We clearly have an interest in the growing problem of cyber attacks and how you can secure your business. We expect that we're down for an hour or so. We've got a Q&A option at the end. But before we start, just a couple of housekeeping notes in that this conference is being recorded. We will email you a link at to the recording afterwards, so you can share it with your friends and colleagues who can't be here. Your microphones will be muted throughout the event, so please submit questions throughout to our team via chat. And any questions that we don't have time to answer, we will follow up after the event. I would like to introduce our speakers today, who will be providing insights into current cyber threats and taking part in a panel discussion as well as a Q&A. Firstly, we have Candid West, who is Vice President of Cyber Research at Acronis. Candid has published many papers and articles on IT security and is an advisor on IT security to the Swiss federal government. We also have James Grove, who is IT Director at Premier League Football Club Southampton. James too has lots of experience, more than 16 years of it in industry experience, including 10 years senior leadership roles at Novartis, where he ran its UK and European business technology partnerships and headed its global IT service management operation. I hope I've done that correctly. I believe I have, James. Just a couple of things. I'd like to run through today's agenda. To start with, I would like to give an insight into the current landscape of cybercrime. When I was researching this with the help of some of my colleagues, I believe that I had a pretty good idea of what was going on in relation to cyber attacks, whether it be enterprise or SMB. But what emerged has really surprised me, and I suspect it will with you as well. I'm going to explain, more importantly, how SMBs are being increasingly targeted by ransomware attacks. After my words, Candid will run through a demonstration of live ransomware attack. He will then take us through why it is important to have a trusted, reliable managed service provider, looking at the recent attack on Kaseya as an example and the lessons that can be learned. Finally, James will join us for a panel discussion, talking through best practices for those that have IT security responsibilities, as well as discussing how the relationship between our three companies have helped to keep Southampton Football Club cyber protected. Small businesses don't think they are a target. Well, they are. Size is no prevention against cyber attacks. And the mistake is thinking that because you're not a large organization, you're safe. We read about the attacks on the Colonial Pipeline in the US with ransomware that shut down fuel supplies to multiple states in the United States, or the attack on the Irish Health Service. And because they were large organizations, suggests that the big guys are the target. That is not the case at all. Over 50% of cyber attacks are targeted toward SMBs. In the last year, 28% of all SMBs suffered data breaches. Now, not all of these were ransomware attacks, but the stats say that at least 1 in 4 of you here today will be compromised in some way within the next 12 months. Another alarming stat is that SMBs, that is up to 60% of those attacked with ransomware, are out of business within 6 months. I'll say that again because I didn't believe it when I read it. Another alarming SMB statistic is that up to 60% of those attacked go out of business within 6 months. It's a frightening statistic. SMBs are more attractive to cyber criminals. Well, the reason that is that because companies are smaller, they are attracted by hackers who see them as an easier target for them to go after. Key reasons to these cyber attacks is that they often lack the knowledge to set up robust security. as a company and or don't allocate enough towards the budget to protect themselves. If you don't do that, the impact on business range from inconvenience, and we've all had an element of that, to total collapse. But the areas that are affected are sales. Companies are compromised, other companies will not do business with them. It affects your brand. It affects your customers' confidence in them doing business with you. And of course, there are GDPR compliance failures as well to consider. Well, one of the ways around that was to get insurance against cyber security, against cyber attacks. It was easy once to get insurance, but that's not the case anymore. Premiums have increased. Businesses need to be protected to stay in place. And in some cases, companies are denied insurance altogether. Cyber attack insurance is becoming as prevalent as car and home insurance. We need to have it, but there are other ways that we can protect ourselves, and we'll come on to that later. The actual ransomware itself is becoming more and more sophisticated. Malware is sneakier than it used to be. The methods use are phishing methods, including emails and links that often look like authentic messages. I personally have seen a number of websites, been shown a number of websites that you would absolutely be convinced that they are the company in question, and they're not. Malware can be hidden in various folders and systems, leading to the inevitable infection and the knock-on effect. We hear regularly the need for endpoint security, and here at Cobweb we're involved in that very heavily. But by endpoint security, we mean that every device that connects to your network, whether it be a laptop, a phone, a tablet, wearables, the list goes on. An endpoint protection plan must include antivirus protection. We're all witnessing a change in the working practices. So the hybrid working that we've been talking about is actually here. I look in the office here today in Cobweb. There are more people in here than there have been for some time, but there are still a significant amount of people who are still working from home from choice. But in doing so, it introduces an element of vulnerability that has never been there before. And these huge gaps in security are ideal settings to infiltrate a network. This next element is, it did surprise me as well, because if things couldn't get worse, we now have ransomware as a service. I haven't made this up. It's ransomware as a service, which is a downloadable package from the dark web. It can be deployed in minutes by people who are particularly unskilled. They are just criminals. But these criminals are smart enough to target the SMBs because they've decided that the SMBs will not be as sophisticated in keeping them out, and they do not want to be detected. And that's one of the reasons why SMBs are perceived as low-hanging fruit. The inference of all these points reveals a serious cyber landscape. And the question is, it's not a question of whether your organization gets attacked, but when will it get attacked? But we can fight back. The next speakers you hear from will help enlighten you and show how simple measures can ensure that we fight back and protect our businesses. Firstly, I'm going to pass over to Candid, VP of Cyber Research at Acronis, who will start with a live demo of a ransom attack. Candid, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. And yes, good afternoon, everyone. So it's my pleasure to show you exactly what you should not do, which is executing a ransomware. And I mean, for the last 20 years, I had the pleasure of doing so. So here is a virtual system, which is, of course, not connected to my production site. On the left, I have a few tools just to help you with. So you see the new processes being started. On the top left, you see registry keys being written through the process monitor. And that will help you to understand that something is going on, right? When there's new processes that start to encrypt. And of course, lower right, we also need a few documents as a kind of a lore that can be attacked and encrypted. And let's assume you receive one of those emails, right? And I still have to do my taxes. So let's assume you received a TurboTax email. You say, well, maybe I did order something, right? So let's click on it. And there's a Word document attached to it. So let's open it, right? what could possibly go wrong. But in this case, well, of course, it will start off windward. We see on the left side, many actions have started. That is normal. That is expected. But you will see in a second that there's also a conti.exe starting, and this is the ransomware. In this case, we're using a vulnerability, so you don't even have to execute the macro. But normally there might be a kind of a, do you really want to execute the macro? And we all know people still click on those. So now it's already too late. You see all my documents have, well, changed. They're still there, but they're encrypted. So they have a new extension there. And well, maybe you would think, okay, it's just renamed, so no harm done, right? Let's rename one of those Excel tables there and see, does it still open, right? Can we actually get to the content? And this will, of course, take a while because the ransomware is still in the background encrypting all my files. But you also see that there's a readme.txt file which has been added on the system, and this is typical. So let's open up this readme.txt file, which you will find all over in all the affected systems. And it will show you that this is the message from the attackers telling you, hey, everything is lost, everything is encrypted. You have to pay me Bitcoins, Monero coins, whatever, through an underground website if you want to have a chance to actually get your data back. And of course, this is kind of the last thing, right? Normally, the attackers will be in your environment for maybe a few weeks. They might have already deleted all your other backups. They might know where your crown jewels are. So not much else you can do than, well, either decide to pay, which we don't recommend, or of course try to restore. And as we've seen in Ireland with the health service executive, that might take months or even half a year to restore back to normal if your backups have been tampered with, or if you don't have backups which are kind of only 5 minutes old. So let's switch over to a second system, which is exactly the same setup, with the sole difference that here we have the Acronis Cyber Protect agent installed. So this is our new agent that we launched last year. And again, let's show up some documents that can be kind of attacked by the ransomware. We will go to the email again. I still need to do my taxes, so let's still open up that Word document here. As I said, we're using the MS-HTML vulnerability in Microsoft, which has been patched yesterday if you apply the patches. So maybe you're still vulnerable. And we'll see Windward started. It will start again, the Conti ransomware. So this payload is in there, right? It will start. But have a look at all the documents on the lower end. They're still there. And now you see the Conti actually disappeared as well on the left. So, well, we even see the Lure document kind of opening. So I see my pseudo invoice of my tax software here. And you might say, well, I actually never ordered it. So yeah, just delete the email, right? But of course, we want to see what happened behind the scenes. So if you switch over to the Cyber Protection console, which is kind of your one-stop solution to show you all the backups, all the antivirus and patching messages, you'll see that there was a process called conti.exe, which has been stopped because of the behavior. We saw that it was trying to encrypt files. So even if you had never seen that ransomware before, it will be able to stop it right out of the box. And any file that it has tampered with will be restored locally from local cache without any user interaction. And of course, if you take the whole suite, it's even better because we have multiple layers of protection. For example, also a URL filtering. So if you click on that document, which is hosted on a malicious website, you would even be blocked here, so you don't even get there. So that's just a quick view. And with that, back to you, Michael.
Thank you very much. I had to turn my camera on and my microphone on, so apologies. So yes, thanks for that, Candid. Interesting and scary, and an insightful way to see that what happens when you click on these things. Now we want to talk about recent ransomware news and the Kaseya attack on an IT provider. So actually on a provider that highlighted the need for a reliable and trustworthy managed service provider. So perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Absolutely. And yes, I mean, we all know about the cyber attacks. You mentioned as well. You might not be aware of all the newest things, but of course, and there are some variations in level of how much security does the service provider actually provide, right? do you trust your service provider? I mean, you can, of course, trust Cobweb, but can you trust your other service providers that you might have? So let's start off with the slides, kind of going over the classical attacks that we see against small businesses, but also against MSPs. Because the infection vector, they are the same. Number one, of course, still being the weak passwords. Unfortunately, we're still fighting with weak passwords, people using the same passwords for their VPN, for their email, and for their LinkedIn and social media accounts. So if one of them is breached, all of them are breached. But we also see the classical phishing attacks, right, where people steal the passwords. And because of the ransomware as a service, we also see ransomware groups now actively recruiting insiders. So they will offer people, disgruntled employees, a percentage, so 2 or 3% of the ransom if they double click the ransomware for the attackers. So do you trust all your employees? Hopefully, yes, right? But you never know. And of course, there's the vulnerability in Exchange, in Citrix, Pulse VPN, any of those services that during the pandemic we had to expose, they will now be attacked. Like RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol, or as I like to call it, the Ransomware Delivery Protocol, because it's very often exposed and unfortunately used for ransomware. So that's the same for SMBs and MSPs, and also the challenges are nearly the same. Nobody has enough resources, right? We're all kind of tight on time, resources, knowledge as well, and the complexity is increasing. Acronis did a survey and we saw kind of how many security solutions do organizations use in parallel. And you can see here 21% are using more than 10 solutions. 21% more than 10 solutions. I mean, just imagine how complex it is to coordinate everything across 10 solutions. There's a high chance of humans making mistakes, and those mistakes, the attackers will definitely find and misuse it against you. But of course, as Michael said, service providers, they have an extra crosshair on their back because they're kind of a gateway to many, many end customers. So they're a multiplier or scaler for the attackers. If they are able to breach a service provider because they're not well protected, then they can use the services already in place by the service provider to roll out their own ransomware with a software deployment system. They can use remote management tools to log into all the machines and change some configuration. Or we've seen some which then just log into the cloud backup solution and delete all the backups before they start encrypting. And unfortunately, yes, this is bad, as of course, unhappy customers will switch. So there's even more pressure for the service provider as well. And we've seen many cases, Sopria, Cosinant, CompuCom, but of course, Kaseya being the recent one. Next slide. So if you remember Kaseya, that was the attack about 2 months ago during a long weekend in the US, a holiday weekend, where the Revile ransomware group managed actually to send out an update, a malicious update, to a few dozen service provider, which then automatically sent it to a few thousands of their end customers. One of the most common ones was the Swedish Co-op supermarket. They had to close down about 700 to 800 shops because nothing was going on anymore. Next slide. So how did they actually do it? Well, the real ransomware group, they managed to find a zero-day vulnerability in the Kaseya VSA. So that's the kind of online console for the service for rolling out new updates. And they managed to find, well, actually in the end was 3 vulnerabilities, which did not have any patches available yet. So even if you are fully patched, nothing you could do against those on that level. But they allowed them to log into the system and create their own new software out kind of deployment and roll it out to all the connected customers. In that case, they called it Kaseya VSA Agent Hotfix, very promiscuous. But again, it's automatically, so it's not a question of if you click yes or no, it will run automatically. It has local admin rights, and it used those to run a PowerShell script to then disable the Windows Defender if you have it installed and weaken a few other security tools. It would then use local Microsoft tools to decrypt the payload. And this payload was actually signed with a stolen digital certificate. So again, it's using your infrastructure against you. That's so-called living off the land. So making it even harder for you to detect it because legitimate tools are used against you. Like PowerShell is legitimate, right? And then in the end, they dropped an old Windows Defender, which had a vulnerability, so they could inject the ransomware into the Windows Defender and then orchestrate everything from this trusted Microsoft signed process. So no wonder that many security solutions just ignored it because it's signed by Microsoft and then had the encryption going on. Acronis Cyber Protect was able to already stop the PowerShell script because that was strange and malicious, and also the later steps where it's trying to inject into the Windows Defender, trying to start encrypting. We can block it at all those multiple levels. Next slide. And this is also what is important. You have to have those multi-level protection, starting off with the vulnerability assessment and patch management. As I mentioned, have you checked that you have applied all the patches from yesterday from Microsoft? Maybe also the one from Chrome and iOS if you're using iPhones. Those need to be applied as quick as possible. Then you should have something like URL filtering, like signature-based, reputation-based file detection, but of course, also machine learning to identify new unknown malware, down to behavior-based analysis. Because if it is encrypting your files, it doesn't matter if you have seen it before or not, you don't want it on your system. But even if all of those steps fail, well, you should have a plan B, right? Always have a plan B. And of course, with Acronis Cyber Protect, you have the integration into the backup and disaster recovery side. So we protect your backups so that they will not get deleted, but you can also spin up a backup as a virtual machine in a minute. So you don't have to wait till you downloaded all the backups and restored it. You can, of course, do that as well. But we also offer you kind of scanning the backup so that if you do restore, you're not just restoring a bad image, you know you have a clean image that you can work on again. Next slide. So it is important that we're kind of have the holistic approach, what we call cyber protection. So it's the security, next-gen cybersecurity, combined with backup and disaster recovery, combined with management, so patch management, but also having an inventory of all your devices. If you don't know that you have a device, how will you be able to protect it, right? And this should be integrated. Next slide. Because of course you can tell me, hey, Candid, I have all the best solution, best of breed, right? I mean, you find many solutions out there, no mistake about that. But again, you're increasing the complexity if you're adding just point solution in a patchwork. We've done the survey, as I mentioned, and around 70 to 80% of all the customers said, oh yeah, we do have those solutions, but we still got compromised because it's so complex, they're just lacking in terms of configuration. Next slide. So as a kind of a closing slide here, it is important to kind of cover the whole breadth, right? You need to start from prevention, because if you can prevent the ransomware from coming in by blocking the email, by securing your passwords, by patching the vulnerabilities, then you don't have to care about restoring with backups or not. So everything you can do early helps you later. But that does not mean you should kind of ignore the response, the recovery, and also the forensics or the root cause analysis. Because if you don't learn from your mistakes, you're unfortunately doomed to repeat them again and again. And yes, they might be very expensive because the impact or the cost of ransomware can be that you have to close down your business, right? Michael said 60% might close down. Even if it's just bad reputation, that can already be bad, right? Or extra work. I think the Irish Health Service executive, they're still fighting now 6 months after the attack, and they assume that it probably will take 1 year to get back to normal. So that's a lot of heavy weight for small businesses, which might not be able to cope with that. Well, let's not waste any more time. Let's go back and start with the panel. Back to you, Michael.
Oh, I know. Okay. Swapping screens. Thank you for that. Yeah, and there again, just additional information. It's a real insight into what is going on, but how we can fight back. So I hope you're finding this helpful. I know that I am. And please keep your questions coming through for the chat. Next up is our panel discussion on how you can build your own plan to fight ransomware, fight back. So James, if I may start with you. I know we have some IT representatives from other sports teams with us. And I wanted to ask you to tell us the types of data you are required to protect at Southampton and why it's important to have the top level of security.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and hello, everyone. Thanks for all the information there, Candid. Really interesting stuff, even though I've heard some of that before, but always makes me think twice. So yeah, Michael, to answer that first question, I think at a football club, like any business, we have critical and confidential data, that we are legally obliged to protect. Also, it's important for us to protect that because we run our business with that data and with that information. And a football club, a Premier League football club in this day and age, is not really any different to any small or medium business. And there are obviously other very big football clubs and global football clubs that are kind of large multinational companies these days. But in that we store and use that important data to run the business. And typically, football clubs are using the same platforms and systems and services that most other businesses and every industry uses. So there's not really any difference there, really. I think my experience with football club and in sport is where we differ slightly is that we have different requirements for data. We have data-intensive imagery and media and analytical data that is very sort of confidential, top priority, and needs to be protected, as you say. And like any business, that critical data does need the top level of security. We need all the things that Candid's just described in terms of those layers of security, especially if we're talking data and backup protection. Having access privilege controls segregated from the network, and vulnerability scans and malware scanning of that data. So that's pretty much the best insight I can give you there, where a football club differs. However, we are very similar, and we operate very similarly to other businesses and people that might be joining on the webinar today.
Thanks for that, James. On another question, we see many attacks, and I know Acronis will see them too, which are due to weak passwords. I'd have thought by now we'd have moved on to something better, but it appears we're stuck with passwords for the moment. What are the most common password management mistakes that you see, and what can we do to improve the situation there?
Yeah, I'm sure Candid and I could talk on this one for another few hours, but I mean, for me, and I always say this, unless a business prioritizes it, the users of the systems in the business and the staff, they will not know how to manage their own passwords, and no one in the business, unless they've been told, will know how to create and manage their own passwords well, to the levels that are needed these days. And also, our users and staff will always go the easiest route to get somewhere. So they just want to access the data. They just want to log on. And if they, creating a simple password or sharing passwords or whatever that might be, those bad practices, it means that you're at a higher risk there. So I think the key thing for anyone listening, if they're in charge of IT or managing passwords or awareness, is really to prioritize that and make sure that as part of your awareness training, that staff have information and understand how to create passwords. But I also think a really common mistake these days is to enforce changing passwords too frequently. So it used to be practice, in IT tech grads quite a few years ago, just to reset passwords as much as possible. But there are other tools now that you can secure, like multi-factor authentication. So I think with enforcing frequent password changes is now considered bad practice as well. So you do need to look at other tools and in your armory around password management. And I'm sure Candid can talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I fully agree there, James. I mean, multi-factor authentication is a very good tool, which is not used enough by most companies because they think it's too complex or their user cannot handle it. But nowadays you can have kind of authentication apps on your mobile phone or getting push messages. So it's actually not too difficult, but it definitely adds a big layer on security on top of it. It's not 100% guarantee. You can still do phishing against it, but it limits it, right? If there is one of those many data leaks, like Facebook, LinkedIn, those passwords will be not as easy usable, right? So that's already bringing you way, way ahead of your competition. And I mean, it just strikes me that people are not making use of it. I also agree that, yeah, changing passwords or enforcing changing the password usually just ends up in adding 2020, 2021, 22, right? You're just adding a system that is allowed. So you're not really adding much security. Rather go the route of enforcing or helping with password managers, right? That they can actually use tools, because I mean, I have hundreds of different passwords. I don't remember all of them by heart, right? I mean, by no means. And I probably will lose even more in the future. But I have password managers that I can trust. So I have the passwords that I need always with me, together with multi-factor authentication. Because we've seen it so many times, unfortunately, that an old password was leaked somewhere. It was not changed, like Colonial Pipeline. They had a VPN password being leaked. And then this was used to access the network and then start the whole very expensive attack, right? You might remember there was a kind of outcry, I think last week, when 500,000 passwords for VPN, for Fortinet VPN gateways have been leaked in the underground, but those were from 2019. So yes, maybe you should have multi-factor on top of it, or maybe you should have changed those passwords after a leak, and then you can still sleep well. So make sure that this happens, because I fully agree with Michael. It kind of sounds weird that we're still fighting with weak passwords. And just imagine if your email, your business email, is compromised, attackers can use it to reset passwords. And I've seen it myself, that they will reset the password to your online console for your online backup, your online security tool. And if you don't have multi-factor authentication, they will get in, delete all your backups, uninstall the antivirus tools, and then you're really naked, and nobody wants to wake up like this.
Absolutely. And as I suspect, speaking on behalf of many people who are listening to this webinar, the introduction of multi-factor authentication is a great blessing, because the number of times I and millions of others have been locked out of everything and ranting and raving at the IT department for insisting that we change the blooming password every 5 minutes. So seriously, MFA has not only helped from a user perspective, but it does make us more secure. And you're right, it's not the panacea, but it certainly moves us a lot closer to that. On another question, the pandemic has revealed new vulnerabilities in many security systems, like exposed cloud services and gaps in remote applications. What can we do to close those vulnerabilities? James? Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. James,
yeah, if I may jump in there, maybe visibility, I think, is the first one I would raise, right? Kind of knowing what's happening, knowing that you have those systems and also those software, right? I mean, it's still very common that companies don't really know, is our Exchange server actually exposed to the internet? I don't really know, right? RDP services. Oh, I thought that's only accessible from IP addresses in the UK. Turns out anyone from China can access them too. So those things, knowing kind of what is exposed, then, of course, doing the monitoring. If you have 100,000 failed logins per day, maybe then it's time to act and kind of try to shield it, right? And of course, the last is patching in time. Because as I mentioned yesterday, Patch Tuesday, we usually call Wednesday the Attack Wednesday. Because the attackers, they know now kind of their 0 days are kind of useless because people will start patching, but they can also reverse engineer the patches and find out, hey, now I understand there was a vulnerability, let's make use of it, right? So as we've seen kind of 4 years ago, right, WannaCry, people still remember it, I hope. The patch was available for 2 months. Still, many people said, yeah, well, I'll patch it in my next window, which is the 1st of October. Oh, 1st of October didn't work. Well, 1st of November works as well. Never do that. Patch on time. It's, again, not the silver bullet for everything, but it reduces your attack surface drastically, so you should do it. But over to you, James.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all the the systems that a business has now, and how many of them connect to the internet. And as I've said before, the attack surface now for most businesses is very, very far and wide. You've got your on-prem potentially, you've got your cloud and SaaS applications, a lot of other cloud services now as well. So, as you say, it's important to understand all of those, the architecture, how they operate, and being able to patch them. I think also as well, when you're doing that, is especially if you're adding more services, spinning up more services, or buying more technical services, it's important to risk assess, those systems and vendors, and keep a risk assessment. So a really simple, step that most businesses can do, and even if you're not technical, is to create a risk register around that, so you can understand and if there are any gaps, either technical knowledge, patching, vulnerabilities, known issues, that kind of thing with those vendors. So that would be something that I would recommend around that. And then as Candy was saying as well, there's a lot of threat intelligence out there that you can get your hands on. So it's important that you do have a mechanism for acting on that. So if you hear about vulnerabilities that are in the news, if you have some, there's threat intelligence tools out there, but also there's a lot of news to consume. You need to make that a subject of interest if you manage your own IT, and really important that it is always front and center of your operations.
Thank you for that, guys. You mentioned earlier about zero trust, and users are clearly one of the weakest points in enabling cyber attacks unintentionally. And there's a statistic that says that 94% of successful malware incursions, including ransomware, originate in email. How can we help users to help us better to stop that?
I'll start with this one if you want. I mean, it goes without saying. I think there's a lot of technical controls first of all, but I think as in the demo earlier on, most of these attachments, people are opening them or wondering whether or not they should open them. And if you're running an awareness campaign around phishing, around the malware that can be received not just within email but within other messaging applications. Because they're frequently used now, so people are using WhatsApp and other messaging tools to conduct business. So important that staff are aware of those threats there, but also there needs to be a mechanism within every business for staff to report those events and those incidents. So they need to know what to do when they get something, and if they think about it before they open it, it gives you're in the right sort of place there. And if they can then report it, to validate it, verify it to IT, that is another good step. And another thing that we're looking at rolling out in Southampton pretty soon, just encouraging our users, is to have a forum. So a lot of businesses now will have a work social media such as Yammer, or as an example, or Facebook Workplace, and there's a lot of communications that happen on there, social stuff, but it's a really good place to actually for staff to report, by the way, guys, I got this email in today, or this text message, don't fall for that, and just sort of get that user community sharing the information, because it adds to that layer of sort of that human firewall and the protection that you're gaining by that enabling your community to actually self-educate each other. So that's really important. That does take a lot of time, but it's easily started off. I think a catalyst for us in Southampton, and I think a lot of businesses, was COVID, because COVID had there was a lot of phishing campaigns by cyber criminals that happened during COVID. Click this link to book your vaccine, or whatever it might be. And I think that was a really good driver for us to start talking to our user community all around how they should be suspicious about these things coming through email. On the technical side, maybe Candy can cover that, but at very basic level, email security is something you need to look at. So the technical controls to quarantine those suspicious links, emails, and attachments, and having other layers of security around that as well. So, but yeah, that would be from just actions and activities that people listening can do. Those are some of the ideas that I'm happy to share, and things that we're doing at Southampton.
And I like that you mentioned the human firewall. I fully agree there. I mean, awareness training is important, but we all know there's at least always one who clicks on every link, no matter how much you train him. And I'm not blaming them. They're just curious, right? But it is important to have an easy way to report those. And if you're not having that, you're kind of missing out on that human firewall aspect. So definitely encourage people to kind of talk about it, because I've seen so many companies where some of the smart people, they say, oh yeah, that was a phishing email, I saw it. But the guy next to them actually clicked on it because they didn't talk about it, right? Or even worse, they said, I wanted to see if he's smart enough as well. I mean, that's not going to help your overall goal. So make sure that it's easy and simple and encouraged to report. And yes, as we started off with kind of the zero trust topic, right? Again, it's multi-layered. So administrative things is one thing, but also technical controls. So trying to filter out emails, the spams, kind of the URLs. And of course, make no mistake about it, the attackers, they're getting more creative and kind of smarter as well. We've seen that they will have the malicious payload in a zip file, and the zip file might either be password protected and they send the password in a second email, so that classical sandbox cannot automatically unpack it, but the user is smart enough to say, oh, there's another email with a password, let's combine the two. Or they will host it on a cloud domain like Azure, Google, Amazon, which often is trusted. So your firewall might say, oh yeah, I know about Azure, I'll let that go. And since it's encrypted, the payload will be downloaded and kind of executed afterwards. So that's why you still need that kind of level of kind of protection, but you can already build kind of a web of trust, a link of trust, because if you receive attachments with executable code from people that you have never dealt business with, then yeah, maybe you don't need to execute them right away, right? Maybe you can leave the attachments and just deliver the email, or even kind of just verify that this is definitely something you want to get through. So yes, email, absolutely agree. It's still the #1 attack vector because it works, right? It's easy and simple for the attackers to do. They send out thousands and hundreds of thousand emails, and it's good enough if one clicks, right? Yeah. It's the classical one. As a defender, you need to defend against everyone, right? But if you have one striker shooting to the goal and hits, that's already bad for your breaks.
That's a nice lead on to the next question, which is that many security analysts say that assumed you've been breached, and I believe them. If successfully compromised is inevitable, what can we do to mitigate it?
I think, yeah. So I think from somebody for myself worked in IT for a long time. You know, a lot of IT departments in organizations are mature around their incident management processes because that's what they've been doing as bread and butter for a number of years. So it's really just leveraging that and building your incident response plan specifically for cyber attacks and cyber incidents. So for me, that's all about building that up, not just around IT, but bringing in other areas of the business to support that and understand what you would do in the event of a cyber incident. You know, preparation. So once you start to develop that, then preparation and actually doing scenario testing. So there's a lot of good tools out there now on the NCSC website for people in the UK listening. There's a really good scenario testing tool called Exercise in a Box, which is free for any UK business. You can download that content, something we've done at Southampton, actually run through those scenarios with staff, with your IT team. There's technical scenarios, there's also sort of other scenarios involving legal and your internal comms, external comms, that kind of thing. So really useful, and start to kind of build that up and build that out. And again, testing that as soon as then you may get an incident. You know, it's not if, it's when it will happen. So you definitely need to be prepared. So don't just do all of that and then, you know, leave it for another year, because again, you need to sort of test that and also have a platform that you can communicate on as well. So you know, if you had a major cyber incident in the next 5 minutes, how would you communicate that to everyone? What would you do? That's a really important thing to think about and get that in your plans as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with the exercise, and I hope, James, you allow me the analogy to football there. I mean, you definitely train for doing the penalties, even if you hope you never have to go to it, right? But that doesn't mean you say, well, I'm sure I'm good with that, don't need to train it. So, I mean, make your plan, make sure you have kind of an emergency or incident response plan. Also check that you know who to call. Best, I always say best is to print it and laminate it. People laugh about it, but if you have it on your internal wiki or Confluence and that page is encrypted, it doesn't really help you much good, right? If you try to find out what's the email address, what's the telephone number of all your staff again. So make sure you have the plan with the right passwords or the right people that have the passwords. And then yes, do the restore. I know it is frightening to switch over and say, okay, let's restore this server to an extra server here, or actually let's pluck it out and see if we're still surviving. Rather do it then when you have all your stuff there compared to the next long weekend, right? I mean, Thanksgiving might be the next big one. And we all know attackers love to do it on long weekends. So I don't know what the next big bank holiday here is in the UK, probably Christmas.
Yeah,
But I mean, be prepared, right? And if you have done the exercise, it will be a lot less stressful. It's still stressful if you're in an incident, but a lot less stressful. And the second point, yes, it's about visibility, right? If they are inside your network, you should know about it, which means, yes, do you have your network segmentation and segregation where you can actually make it more difficult for them to hop from one machine to another? But also you should actually see those failed logins, those strange things that Anna from HR is logging into 30, 40 different machines, which she never does, right? Those should raise a few alert bells where at least someone should take a look and say, hey, maybe we should investigate what's going on. I always say ransomware is an easy one because once all your data is encrypted, you will notice because it's very noisy, right? But that's too late. If they are inside your network for 2 or 3 weeks, and as we all know, encryption is just one part, they will steal all your interesting data. They will steal the contracts of your cyber insurance so that they know how much you're willing to pay. Those are all things you can actually detect if you know where to look for. So yeah, be prepared as always.
Thank you for that. That's quite ironic, isn't it? That they can look at what your insurance cover is and then base their ransom on that. I hadn't thought about that one.
Yeah, and this actually happened in the UK with a retailer. They basically said, no, we cannot pay that much. And then the ransomware gang said, hey, but you're insured for 6 million. So why are you kind of trying to be fuzzy here? And that's a really bad situation you don't want to be in.
True. And leading on to the next question about, there are many people attending today who are small and medium-sized business owners or IT managers of companies. You've given us lots of great information there, some scary stuff at the beginning, but some good stuff about what we can do about it. But truly addressing cybersecurity can be a daunting task. Where should they get started? James mentioned about NIST, but what other areas should they be looking at now?
I mean, I can give a list of a few things that I would do on a small budget. So I mean, things you can do for free. So start off with your IT policies and your processes that you manage the internal IT team with. So make sure you've got an IT security policy. Make sure staff are aware at the very basic level of their responsibilities in using IT systems in your business. And obviously, when you roll that out, then there's a good piece of awareness that staff will hopefully gain as part of that. And yes, talking of awareness, make sure that staff are aware of the very basics of what they should be doing. We talked about passwords earlier, but there is free training as well available on the NCSC website now. Again, for UK businesses, you can roll that out to your staff, allow your staff to have access to that. And that gives you the very, very kind of basics of all the different information they need to know in this day and age about protecting the business. So things like password management and phishing, all those kind of things. And then a really good framework that you can start to look at as well is Cyber Essentials in the UK. So that's a self-assessment, or you can have Cyber Essentials Plus, which is an actual assessment that someone will do on your business. And it really goes through all of your kind of technical architecture, but also your policies, your process, how you operate the business, and how secure it is. And if you meet all those standards, then you gain that level of Cyber Essentials. And I think you have to renew that annually as well. So it's something that you can factor in regularly to your business. Also, it does give you can have that Cyber Essentials badge on your business, and it shows that you do have that level of IT security across your business. Again, that's really cheap just to get that. And then I mentioned earlier about risk assessing. So you've got vendor risk assessing, but you can also do that around security incidents or IT security or IT overall. You should be doing that. Again, very difficult if you've got a small IT team to continually do that, but it's good to start that off, and then maybe review that every month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks or something. See where you are. Are you dealing with those risks? Whether it's upgrades, implementations, those kind of things. And then off the back of that, you can start to produce a maturity roadmap around your systems and your IT security. So, Cyber Essentials gives you a really good framework. Once you gain that, you can then say, right, what's the next level? What do I need to do? There's some of the technical control or the technical systems the layers that Candid mentioned earlier. Not every business is going to have all those next gen layers, or they may not need them. However, it's important to start to build that maturity roadmap out and understand kind of where you're going next, what services you're going, what security do you need for those services. And then obviously we talked about vulnerabilities, threat intelligence, basic patching, hygiene, all those kind of things that an IT department should be doing, but it does need to happen. You need to make sure that is part of the process and that isn't lagging behind, and that there is some mechanism there of doing that regularly. Obviously backups, we talked about that, so that is probably the most essential thing. But again, you should already have a backup system budget already if you have a small budget. So it's looking at, are you maximizing that? Are you getting the most from that? Are there other systems out there? Should you be, other vendors, cloud things and all those kind of things. So I think that's another area that I would look at as a very kind of basic level.
Candid, would you like to add to that?
I mean, it's already fantastic points there. NCSC for UK or NIST, the US, they do have specifically for small businesses the essentials that you should do. So don't think, oh, it's so complex, I can't handle it. They boil it down to the kind of 10 minimum things that you should do. If you want to boil it down to 3, I would say yes. Make sure that you have a good password, let's say hygiene and process for overall, multi-factor, zero trust, whatever applies to you. Make sure that you have patch management in order. So kind of how are you dealing with it, that all of your systems are patched as quickly as possible, and having backup disaster recovery, making sure that your backup is not half a year old and that you can actually restore it if you need it. Those 3, if you have those, you're already better than, unfortunately, the majority of businesses out there. So as the old saying goes, you don't have to be faster than your neighbor, not faster than the lion, just faster than your neighbor, right? So make sure that you do the minimal.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just picking up on something James mentioned, it's perhaps worth mentioning that we provide a no-charge security score audit, which is exactly the area that we're talking about now. For the people on this call, we're going to send out a follow-up email, and there will be a link on there should you require this secure score audit, which we're more than happy to do. Finally, thank you, gentlemen, for that. Finally, to our Q&A section. So my colleague Rich, who's just left the room, let me know what questions have been asked. Rich, can you hear me?
I think I can. Yep.
Excellent.
First question was hello. First question was from Chris, and that is, what is the best way of getting rid of a suspicious email that you haven't yet opened that might have a harmful attachment?
The best way, well, deleting it, I guess, sounds a bit too obvious. Probably depends a little bit where you got it from. But yes, delete it. Of course, opening the attachment, that's kind of the worst thing. There are some exploits that could be triggered just by viewing the email if you have HTML or picture loading enabled. So best thing would be to kind of delete it without having the preview. Or if you're paranoid, you can also do it from your mobile phone, like iPhone. Usually tends to be a bit more secure than a Windows device, let's say.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we normally recommend that it gets deleted. So it can't be forwarded or shared again or opened. I mean, yeah, talking of mobiles, I think if you think of how many times of you now are starting to receive SMS messages, phishing in that way. So as soon as I get one of those, I delete it straight away. Don't be tempted to click on that link or open the attachment.
Okay. The next question from Alexandra was: would you advise against using Huawei devices within an organization?
Well, that's
interesting. So I assume it's because of
Mobile?
the rumors about backdoors. James, you want to comment first?
Yeah, but, whether that's, yeah, I suppose mobiles. I mean, yeah, I suppose it's about risk assessing. I think it's not something I haven't had any experience with Huawei devices, but yeah, obviously aware of the vulnerabilities, and I think a lot of organisations do have a standard fleet of devices, if we're talking mobile phones, that they would use, and just making sure that you risk assess that hardware, those systems, or the operating systems that you're going to be rolling out, and also maybe having a method of managing that. So you've got your mobile device management tools that you can roll out. That's always quite important, and another sort of layer of security if you have a fleet of mobiles across your business.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would add, I mean, again, it's risk assessment, right? There have been some vulnerabilities in networking devices, but not just from Huawei, right? There have been default password credentials being left in nearly every other network device as well. So in the end, it doesn't matter which vendor, either you trust them or you don't, but you should monitor it anyway to see if there are strange things happening on those devices.
And there's kind of other mainstream networking devices, and you mentioned Fortinet earlier, I think, Candid, and that's one that's fairly widespread. So that there's always those other platforms and hardware vendors that also maybe have those vulnerabilities. So you do need to keep an eye on everything that you've got in your estate.
Okay, next question was, we are an SMB of 9 employees across 3 countries. How can we ensure that we are covering all our bases in terms of attacks?
Okay.
I think, the advice that I went through, the kind of free advice, and the things that you can do as a very basic level. Happy to share a list of that on your email that you send out, Michael, at the end of this. But yeah, those things really are important. I think if you've got that number of employees, which is quite a small number, that you want to be looking at the very basic systems that you're using. Are they secure enough? I suppose you might not be using all enterprise level systems, with a business that size. So, are you using consumer things? If you are, or what security vulnerabilities do that have? What drawbacks may they have versus an enterprise version of, Microsoft 365 or something like that. So it's just important that you look at that, and then obviously something that you can scale if and when and as your business grows.
Yeah, I would agree. Kind of depends a little bit on if you're fully on Microsoft 365, if you use some special cloud applications, so might need to be assessed. And of course, Cobweb is a partner that can help you with doing some of those assessments as well. But in the end, yes, you need an end-to-end protection. As I said, you should have patch management in mind. You should have passwords in mind. Of course, a classical antivirus with behavior-based detection and backup. I think those are definitely some of the minimal ones that you should have, regardless of what you use.
Okay, that brings us to the top of the hour. So certainly, I've got some more questions. So Josie and James, we will get back to you with the answers from the guys on the other questions, but I'll pass back over to Michael to wrap up.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd just like to say a big thank you to James and Candid. Really, that was excellent stuff. So informative at a time when people are so aware of what can happen. And I think the answers that were given today help people formulate what they should be doing. Ranging from basic stuff to making sure that there's enough budget to cover what your company needs. I hope you found it useful. I know I have. And I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.